Vermont's Green Mountains are known for their postcard beauty, but deep within their oldest forests lies a region where people step into the wilderness and disappear into its darkness. Glastenbury Mountain rises quietly in the southwestern corner of the state, just north of Bennington. It is not the tallest peak, nor the most remote, yet it carries a sense of isolation that feels deeper than elevation alone. The forest here is thick with spruce, hemlock, and hardwoods that have reclaimed nearly everything humans once built. And in the quiet that settles over the slopes, there is a feeling, subtle but undeniable, that the land is holding something back, something older than memory. Even seasoned hikers speak of an unusual stillness. Sound doesn't carry the way it should. Trails narrow without warning. The forest floor, thick with moss and fallen needles, absorbs footsteps until movement seems to vanish into silence. Light filters through the canopy in thin, uneven bands, dimming long before dusk actually arrives. Fog can form in minutes, draping the mountain in a shroud that disorients even the experienced. It is a place where the wilderness feels untamed, not hostile, but indifferent in a way that demands respect. And for reasons no one has ever fully understood, some who enter never return. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 individuals, each with different backgrounds, different ages, different reasons for being near Glastenbury, vanished with stunning suddenness. An experienced hunting guide disappeared just steps ahead of his companions. A college student walked onto a familiar trail and was never seen again. A war veteran vanished from a moving bus. A young boy in a bright red jacket wandered only moments out of sight, and a woman hiking with her cousin simply failed to return to the trail. 5 years, 5 disappearances, 1 mountain at the center. The cases share almost nothing on the surface. No common perpetrator, no shared motive, no pattern of time, season, or circumstance that investigators could unquestionably link. What connected them, and what continues to haunt the region, was the complete absence of evidence. Not a footprint, not a torn piece of clothing, not a single trace indicating which direction each person traveled in those final moments. Search parties swept the mountains. Volunteers formed long chains across the slopes, stepping methodically through brush and undergrowth. Bloodhounds traced faint trails that dissolved on the wind. Planes circled above the canopy, scanning for open patches of ground, broken branches, or the flash of a jacket. Families waited for answers that never came, but the wilderness gave nothing back. Each disappearance deepened a wound in the community, a sense of helplessness that grew heavier with every passing day. Hunters avoided the region. Locals spoke about the mountain with caution. College students whispered Paula Welden's name in residence halls long after she was gone, and reporters from across New England converged on Bennington, searching for patterns that law enforcement could not find. Yet the mountain remained silent. By the time Frida Langer disappeared in 1950, fear had already settled deeply into the surrounding towns. It was a quiet fear, unspoken in public but unmistakable, the kind that changes behavior, that keeps people close to the roads and out of the woods after dusk. Parents watched their children more closely. Hikers planned their routes with greater caution. Some avoided the area altogether. Out of this unease, a phrase began to circulate, first casually, then with growing acceptance: the Bennington Triangle. It was a name intended to capture the strangeness of the disappearances, the proximity in which they occurred, and the chilling lack of answers. Over time, it became the defining term for a mystery now woven into the region's identity. But the real story is not the name. It is not folklore or exaggerated tales told around campfires. It is a real sequence of events, documented, investigated, remembered, that unfolded in the lives of ordinary people who stepped into a familiar wilderness
and did not return. For the families, the pain was immediate and lasting. For investigators, the frustration was profound. And for the state of Vermont, the disappearances exposed gaps in emergency coordination that would ultimately reshape law enforcement for generations. Even today, decades later, Glastenbury Mountain carries the reputation forged during those years. The area remains largely unpopulated, reclaimed by nature, threaded only by rough trails and remnants of old logging roads. Visitors describe a sense of isolation that feels deeper than geography, as if the land is keeping its distance, reserving its history behind a wall of quiet. To stand on one of its narrow ridgelines is to feel the weight of time. To watch the light fade through its trees is to sense the fragility of orientation, and to hear the wind move through its high branches is to understand why these disappearances left a mark so difficult to erase. 5 people vanished. Their names echo through newspapers, search logs, family memories, and historical accounts of mid-20th century Vermont. Their stories, those separated by circumstance, remain connected by a single question that has never been answered. How can so many vanish so completely? Glastenbury Mountain holds no voice to explain what happened, no witness, no record in the soil or the stone, only silence, thick, unmoving, and unchanged by the passing of more than 70 years. And so, the story begins not with solutions, but with absence, with empty trails, unbroken snow, and paths that lead into forests where the world narrows and sightlines disappear, with families waiting for footsteps that never return, with the quiet understanding that nature, beautiful as it is, can be unyielding in its mystery. This is the Bennington Triangle, not a myth, not a campfire tale, but a real chapter of American history carved into the rugged slopes of a mountain that has kept its secrets longer than anyone can remember. 5 people walked towards Glastenbury. 5 people vanished. And one mountain still holds the silence.
Today, few people willingly venture into the remote slopes of Glastenbury Mountain. Even locals, generations removed from the disappearances, speak of the area with a quiet hesitation, a flicker of caution that seems inherited rather than learned. Hikers choose other trails, hunters avoid the deep timberlands, and for many in southwestern Vermont, the thought of stepping into those woods still stirs an uneasy feeling, shaped by the decades of silence and unanswered questions that hover over the land. But the mountain's unsettling reputation did not begin with the disappearances of the 1940s and 50s. What happened there in those years only intensified what had already been true for much longer. Glastenbury has always been a place where human plans faltered, where communities struggled, and where the land refused to be tamed. Long before the first settler cut a tree or built a cabin, the Abenaki people traveled through this region. Their relationship with the land was marked with respect and practicality. While there is no verified record of supernatural lore tied specifically to Glastenbury, historical accounts and anthropological notes suggest the Abenaki viewed the area as difficult and unpredictable, a place used for hunting or passage, not for establishing long-term camps. The terrain was rugged, weather shifted rapidly, and the forest grew densely enough to challenge even skilled trackers. To the Abenaki, the land itself presented hazards that encouraged caution, and over time, those practical warnings would echo through the experiences of everyone who tried to settle here. By the mid-1800s, the lure of industry brought new life to Glastenbury's slopes. Logging companies arrived first, carving rail lines into the steep terrain so they could haul out vast quantities of timber. The mountain's dense forests provided hemlock, spruce, and hardwood that fueled a bustling period of regional growth. Charcoal kilns operated day and night, transforming cut timber into fuel for iron production. Mills sprang up, powered by the mountain streams that rushed down the steep grades. Temporary camps grew into clusters of cabins, and clusters of cabins grew into the beginnings of a small town. For a short time, Glastenbury had the appearance of a place on the rise, an isolated but industrious settlement energized by the booming demand for natural resources. But the mountain resisted every attempt to establish permanence. The soil on its slopes was thin and unstable, poorly suited for farming. Roads were continually damaged by storms, washouts, and early snows. The rail line had to be rebuilt again and again, suffering from the mountain's relentless freeze-thaw cycles. And most critically, the very industry that sustained the town was also the one that guaranteed its demise. The forests were harvested faster than they could regenerate. The timber supply dwindled. The charcoal kilns that had once glowed through the night fell silent. What remained was a fading community perched on land too harsh to support anything else. By the early 20th century, Glastenbury was already in rapid decline. The population dwindled, buildings deteriorated, and the mountain reclaimed the spaces where families had once lived. In 1937, the state of Vermont officially unincorporated the town, effectively erasing it from the map as a functioning municipality. Few places in New England share that distinction. Glastenbury became known as a ghost town long before the disappearances made it infamous. With the people gone, the forest returned quickly. Trees grew through old foundations. The railroad beds collapsed into moss-covered trenches. Trails once used for hauling timber were swallowed in thick undergrowth. Weathered stones from the charcoal kilns crumbled deeper into the soil. In just a few decades, almost every human trace had vanished beneath a blanket of wilderness that felt older than its years. The land did not merely recover, it closed itself off. By the 1940s, Glastenbury Mountain had become a place few visited unless they had a specific purpose: hunting in autumn, foraging in late summer, or hiking sections of the Long Trail which passed across the mountain's western flank. But even for those who entered with experience and preparation, the terrain was unforgiving. The slopes are steep and uneven, shaped by ancient geological forces that carved deep ravines and narrow ridgelines. Weather patterns shift abruptly due to the mountain's position within the greens. Fog can roll in thick enough to erase visibility within minutes. Heavy rains transform small brooks into fast-moving streams. Winter arrives early and lingers long after nearby valleys have thawed. Navigation, even with a map, can become disorienting. Trails that appear clear in one season vanish by the next. Fallen branches and new undergrowth reshape the landscape in subtle ways that confuse even seasoned hikers. It is a place where human presence feels temporary, where the wilderness dictates the terms. This was the backdrop to the vanishings that would soon grip the region. In 1945, when the first disappearance occurred, Glastenbury Mountain was already a patchwork of abandoned roads and fading industrial remnants. Few permanent residents lived near its base. The old town structures were collapsing or had already vanished beneath the forest. The railroad bed passed through the region, which brought occasional hikers into the mountain, but otherwise Glastenbury remained quiet, isolated, lightly traveled, and known mostly for its rugged terrain. To the people who lived in nearby communities such as Bennington, Shaftesbury, and Woodford, the mountain was a familiar landmark, but one that demanded caution. Tales of hunters getting lost, hikers disoriented by early snowfall, or travelers misjudging distances were common. Not unusual enough to be alarming, but frequent enough to reinforce the idea that Glastenbury Mountain was a place where mistakes became costly. Still, nothing in its past, not the Abenakis' avoidance, not the industrial collapse, not the early tales of difficult travel, could prepare the region for what was about to unfold. The series of disappearances between 1945 and 1950 did not mark the beginning of Glastenbury's troubled reputation, but they transformed it. They took what had been whispers of difficulty and carved them into the landscape permanently. 5 people, each confident enough to enter the woods, each completely unconnected to the others, walked into this environment and vanished with astonishing thoroughness. In a land abandoned by a town, a region avoided by the Abenaki, a mountain reclaimed by wilderness, and a landscape soon to be etched into national memory for reasons far more haunting. By the time the first disappearance shocked southwestern Vermont in 1945, Glastenbury Mountain was already a place with a troubled past. What came next would turn it into something else entirely, a stretch of wilderness where 5 stories would unfold, 5 lives would change course, and 5 families would step into decades of unanswered questions. And it would begin with the disappearance of the one man no one believed could ever be lost.
The mystery begins with the disappearance of the one man people believed could never be lost, a woodsman whose life was defined by these mountains and whose confidence in their terrain had always been unshakable. On November 12, 1945, 68-year-old Middie Rivers stepped onto familiar ground near the Long Trail and the Hell Hollow area of Glastenbury Mountain. For most men his age, the region's steep ridges and rugged cuts would have posed a challenge, but for Rivers, this landscape was as close to home as any house or hearth. He was a lifelong resident of the area, a hunter, a fisherman, and a guide who had spent decades navigating the deep timberlands of southwestern Vermont. To the group of hunters who joined him that morning, Rivers was the anchor, the figure who knew every brook crossing, every ridge crest, every bend of the trail. His experience brought others comfort. When you followed Middie Rivers, you felt safe. The hunt began like countless others had, moving through rolling woods where the November air was cold but not yet brutal. Fallen leaves covered the ground in bronze and gold, muffling footsteps. The sky hung low, gray and heavy, casting a pale light through the trees. For the men walking behind Rivers, nothing about the day suggested the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the region for generations. As the afternoon stretched on, the hunters turned back toward their camp, moving at an unhurried pace. Rivers took the lead, as he always did, striding just ahead of the group. This was routine. He often walked slightly faster than the others, scouting the path ahead, sometimes slipping around a bend before the rest caught up. It was never cause for alarm. But on this day, when the men rounded the next curve in the trail, Rivers was gone. There was no shout, no crash through the brush, no sign of distress. One moment he was visible, his figure moving confidently along the path. The next, the trail ahead was empty, silent, still, and undisturbed. At first, the group assumed he had simply moved farther ahead. They picked up their pace, calling his name into the trees, expecting his voice to answer from somewhere just out of sight, but the only reply was the wind through bare branches. When the hunters reached camp and found no sign of him, concern hardened into fear. The search began immediately. By nightfall, word had spread through the surrounding towns. What followed became one of the largest search efforts in Vermont's early 20th century history. Volunteers poured in from Bennington, Shaftesbury, Woodford, and other nearby communities. Experienced woodsmen joined the hunt. Law enforcement officers from multiple jurisdictions arrived, and as the search intensified, National Guard members were deployed to assist. The search area expanded quickly, stretching across steep ridges, dense thickets, and the deep cuts of the mountain's northern slopes. Rivers knew every inch of this land, yet it was the land itself that seemed to erase him. Search teams combed ravines where a person could fall unseen. They waded through stream beds, scanning for torn fabric or footprints in the mud. They climbed ridgelines, calling his name into the cold November air. Bloodhounds tracked potential trails, but each one dissolved into nothing. No scent led to a discovery, no direction provided clarity. Each day ended as it began, with the mountain keeping its silence. Aerial searches were conducted, an unusual measure at the time for rural disappearances. Small aircraft circled above the canopy, the pilots looking for any break in the forest that might indicate a body or a distress signal. But nothing appeared out of place. No flash of clothing, no disturbed foliage, no trace of a man who had walked into the woods with complete confidence. Authorities considered every possibility. Had he slipped into a ravine, become injured and unable to call out, wandered off in search of game and become disoriented? But the reality was that Rivers' experience made such scenarios seem unlikely. He knew the terrain intimately. He understood weather conditions, knew how to stay warm, and carried the instincts of someone who had survived countless days and nights in the mountains. Yet the fact remained, he was gone. As days turned to weeks, the urgency of the search collided with the acceptance that no resolution was in sight. Volunteers continued to arrive, refusing to give up, but winter crept closer. Snow dusted the trails, temperatures dropped. The window for survival, if there had been one, closed. By late November, the official search scaled down. The landscape had yielded nothing. Not a jacket, not a rifle, not a boot print. It was as if the forest had absorbed him completely. For the townspeople who knew Rivers, the disappearance was incomprehensible. He was the guide, the one others relied upon when conditions were harsh or terrain confusing. His absence created a ripple of fear, a sense that if someone like him could vanish so suddenly and completely, then protection was an illusion. Familiarity with the land no longer guaranteed safety. Rumors spread quietly through the community. Some believed he had experienced a sudden medical emergency and fallen into a concealed area. Others suspected he may have taken an uncharacteristic misstep. But none of these theories explained the lack of physical evidence. Even in difficult terrain, most missing persons leave some indicator of their path, footprints, broken branches, something. Here, there was nothing. The newspapers covered the story extensively in the weeks that followed. National outlets picked it up as winter deepened, highlighting the strange nature of the disappearance. But as with many cases that occur in rugged wilderness, media attention eventually shifted elsewhere. The community did not. For those who lived near Glastenbury Mountain, Rivers' absence lingered in daily conversation, in whispered warnings, in the shared understanding that the land had revealed a darker side of its indifference. When spring returned, melting away the snow, searchers tried once more. They walked the same routes, checked the same ravines, traced the same streams. The hope, faint but present, was that the thaw might reveal something the earlier searches had missed, but the mountain remained consistent in its silence. No trace of Middie Rivers was ever found. His disappearance became the first in a string of cases that would soon define the region's reputation. Yet at the time, no one imagined it was the beginning of anything. It was a tragedy, a bewildering one, but still an isolated event in the eyes of investigators. The idea of a pattern was years away. Still, for the families and communities who lived in the shadow of Glastenbury Mountain, the loss of Rivers marked a shift in how the mountain was perceived. It was no longer merely rugged or remote. It was unpredictable, unforgiving, capable of swallowing a man whose life had been built in its depths. In the months that followed, hunters tread more carefully. Hikers kept closer watch on the trail. Even children, hearing their parents whisper about Rivers at the dinner table, learned to respect the land in a way that bordered on fear. But no one, not even those who sensed something deeply unsettling, could have predicted that the disappearance of Rivers was only the beginning. The mountain would soon claim another life, and this time, The missing person would draw national attention, reshape law enforcement in Vermont, and ignite a mystery that would echo across generations. On the first day of December in 1946, the quiet campus of Bennington College settled into a typical Sunday rhythm. Students studying in common rooms, writing letters home, preparing for the final weeks of the semester. Snow had not yet claimed the landscape, but winter was approaching, and the late afternoon carried the sharp edge of early cold. Among the thousands of small, ordinary decisions made that day, one would become part of one of the most baffling mysteries in the history of New England. 18-year-old Paula Welden, a sophomore studying art, decided to take a walk. She was known for her thoughtful presence and quiet independence, a student who embraced the serenity of the outdoors, often hiking or exploring the trails around campus. The long trail, which passed through the foothills of Glastenbury Mountain, was familiar to students, local residents, and travelers alike. It was not considered dangerous, especially during daylight hours, and certainly not to someone as physically capable and level-headed as Paula. That Sunday, she wore a bright red parka, jeans, and lightweight shoes, clothing suited for a brisk walk but not for extended exposure to freezing temperatures after dark. She left her books in her room, telling her roommate only that she was stepping out. She did not bring a map, a bag, or additional layers. The walk was meant to be short. This simple decision would place her at the center of one of Vermont's most enduring tragedies. Around mid-afternoon, witnesses saw Paula leaving campus and walking along a road that led toward the trailhead. The day was bright but fading quickly, the sun dropping behind the mountains earlier than she likely expected. Several people later reported seeing her: a driver who offered her a lift part of the way, a group of hikers who noticed her distinctive red coat, and an older couple who observed her walking alone deeper into the forest. These would be the last confirmed sightings of Paula Welden. Her presence on the long trail that day is not disputed. What happened after she stepped into the woods has never been determined. Back on campus, Sunday evening unfolded quietly. When Paula did not return by curfew, her roommate assumed she was out late or staying with friends. The expectation of normalcy persisted until the next morning, when her empty bed and untouched belongings signaled something far more serious. By midday on Monday, concern escalated into alarm. The search began close to home. Students and staff combed the areas immediately surrounding the college. Administrators contacted local authorities, while Paula's father, William Welden, traveled from Connecticut with a determination to find his daughter that would define the months and years ahead. Very quickly, the case expanded beyond anything the small local police forces were equipped to handle. By Tuesday, news of Paula's disappearance had reached national outlets. Reporters descended upon Bennington, attracted by the strange, sudden nature of the case and the fact that an 18-year-old college student could vanish without explanation along a well-traveled path. The long trail, normally a symbol of Vermont's natural beauty, now became the focus of intense scrutiny. Search parties mobilized across the region. Hundreds of volunteers, students, local residents, hikers, hunters, and law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions joined forces. Airplanes scanned the dense canopy from above. Bloodhounds traced possible routes Paula might have taken, following the trail to a point where the scent dissolved. The forest floor was covered in fallen leaves. Tracks could be easily lost, buried, or never formed clearly at all. The terrain, though not considered treacherous under normal circumstances, became a complicated labyrinth for search teams unfamiliar with its twists and subtle shifts. The days passed without discovery. No clothing, no footprints, no discarded objects. Nothing that belonged to Paula. Her father grew increasingly distressed and frustrated. He believed, correctly, that Vermont lacked a centralized law enforcement agency capable of managing a search of this scale. At the time, each small town maintained its own police force,
and coordination across multiple towns was slow, complicated, and hindered by unclear jurisdiction. Leads were missed or duplicated. Search efforts overlapped inefficiently. Information was not shared in a cohesive way. The absence of a unified response hindered every attempt to find Paula. Reporters documented the confusion publicly, amplifying the controversy. For the first time, Vermont's lack of a statewide policing structure became a national conversation. The pressure mounted quickly. Meanwhile, Paula's disappearance dominated headlines across the country. Her red parka became a poignant symbol, a detail that should have made her easier to find, but instead underscored the impossible silence that met each day's search. Her youth, her promise, and the mystery of her last known moments captured the attention of the nation. Yet, despite the intensity of the investigation, no reliable evidence surfaced. Hints and rumors circulated, possible sightings in nearby towns, theories about whether she had met someone along the trail, and questions about whether she had ventured farther than anyone expected. But none of these leads produced results. The landscape remained impenetrable to the search teams, offering no clues about her direction or fate. The community around Bennington felt the weight of her disappearance immediately. Students lived with a newfound fear that replaced the sense of safety they had once felt on campus. Residents who had spent their lives hiking the long trail now approached the woods with caution. Parents warned their children not to venture far from home. The trails that wound through Glastenbury began to feel darker, less familiar. By late December, the official search scaled back. Winter storms had begun to blanket the mountain, covering any potential evidence beneath snow and ice. Her father refused to give up. He pressed investigators, challenged authorities, and funded additional private search efforts, but the harsh Vermont winter made continued searching nearly impossible. When spring arrived, thawing the forest and revealing new growth, teams returned to the region in the hope that melting snow might expose what winter had hidden. They found nothing. Paula Welden had vanished completely, without a trace, without witness, and without explanation. The impact of her disappearance resonated far beyond the immediate tragedy. The failures in coordination and communication exposed by the investigation led directly to political action. In 1947, just months after the search had ended, the Vermont state legislature established the Vermont State Police. Paula's case became the catalyst for a modern statewide law enforcement agency, designed to bring organization, training, and emergency coordination to future investigations. Her disappearance did not just change the lives of those who knew her, it changed the structure of policing in Vermont forever. But for Paula's family and for those who walked the long trail in the decades that followed, the unanswered questions remained. Who was the last person to see her alive? How far did she actually walk? Did she ever leave the trail at all? Could she have fallen, been injured, or succumbed to exposure in a place searchers somehow missed? Or was something else at play, something the investigation could never uncover? These questions endure because the land offered no answers. Despite the massive effort, despite the scope of the search, despite the national spotlight, Paula Welden simply vanished into the folds of a mountain that had already claimed one life the previous year. In time, her story would become one of the central pillars of what people began calling the Bennington Triangle, a region marked by disappearances so unusual, so starkly without evidence, that they defied explanation. For Paula's family, and for those who walked the long trail in the decades that followed, the unanswered questions remained. For the state of Vermont, her case became a turning point, and for the mountain itself, it became another secret held tightly beneath its silent canopy. 2 people were gone now, and the shadow over Glastenbury Mountain was growing.
The disappearance of Paula Welden did more than ignite one of the largest searches in Vermont's history. It exposed profound weaknesses in how the state responded to crises. It revealed cracks in the system that had gone unnoticed for decades. And in the aftermath of this failure, Vermont would be forced to confront a hard truth. it did not have the resources or the infrastructure to handle a disappearance of this magnitude. In 1946, Vermont had no statewide law enforcement agency. The responsibilities that today would fall to a coordinated network of trained officers were instead split among small, scattered town departments, each operating within its own jurisdiction and with varying levels of experience. Communication systems were basic, procedures for large-scale searches were inconsistent, and there was no centralized command capable of uniting these fragmented efforts under a single organized strategy. Paula Welden's disappearance revealed all of this at once, dramatically, and with consequences that echoed across the entire state. When news of her disappearance broke, it spread quickly through Bennington College, then through the surrounding towns, and finally across Vermont. By the following morning, hundreds of people were ready to assist, but there was no coordinated structure to guide their efforts. Students went one direction, sheriff's deputies another, volunteers still another. Trails were searched multiple times in overlapping groups, while other areas, equally promising, were missed entirely. It was a search effort powered by urgency and hope, but hindered by confusion. Local authorities struggled to interpret witness accounts. Some reports of Paula's movements were delayed, others were contradictory. Efforts to track her path along the long trail depended heavily on the memories of hikers who had seen her red coat, but those sightings varied in time and location. Without a central command to organize, verify, and sequence these details, much of the early investigation was lost in a haze of incomplete information. Witness statements were gathered, but not always shared effectively across departments. Maps were drawn, but not always coordinated. Leads were pursued by some officials, but never communicated to others. Entire sections of forest were searched with intense focus, only for investigators to later learn that those areas had already been covered by volunteers days earlier. The effort was immense, but the structure was insufficient. Paula's father, William Welden, arrived in Bennington only hours after receiving the news. His desperation to find his daughter was immediate, and his frustration grew with each passing day. He observed the confusion firsthand, groups of searchers returning from long sweeps without knowing whether the territory they'd covered had been checked before, volunteers missing key instructions, separate law enforcement agencies working without shared protocols. He pressed for greater organization, he demanded clearer leadership, and as the days turned into a week, he made phone calls to police officials in other states, urging them to assist. His persistence eventually brought resources from Massachusetts and Connecticut, but even then, jurisdictional uncertainty slowed their involvement. Newspapers captured this frustration with blunt clarity. National headlines shined a harsh light on Vermont's scattered law enforcement network. They questioned why, in a disappearance drawing national attention, there was no unified system capable of managing an operation of this scale. They noted the tension between local sheriffs and college officials, the disagreements between municipalities about which agency should take charge, and the lack of standard search procedures for wilderness emergencies. Criticism intensified when it became evident how quickly the trail had grown cold. Days had passed before the long trail was thoroughly searched end to end. Bloodhounds were brought in, but weather, crowds, and delayed coordination complicated their work. No clear command center existed. No statewide system for missing person alerts was in place. The investigation was comprehensive in effort, but fragmented in execution. To the public, it was unacceptable. To Paula's father, it was unimaginable. And to Vermont lawmakers, it became a call to action. As the search entered its second week, pressure from citizens, students, and the national press demanded structural change. Editorials argued that Vermont was no longer the quiet, isolated rural state it had once been. It needed modern policing, professional coordination, and standardized emergency response capabilities. While the search continued across the mountains, legislatures in Montpelier began drafting proposals. They cited Paula's disappearance explicitly in hearings and public statements.
They argued that Vermont could not rely on a patchwork of small-town departments to manage major incidents. They called for a statewide force, trained, organized, and unified. By January 1947, just weeks after the official search for Paula had concluded, Vermont lawmakers introduced a bill to create the Vermont State Police. Debate was swift and decisive. The tragedy of Paula's disappearance had touched every corner of the state, and there was widespread belief that a coordinated search in those crucial early days might have made a difference. Whether it would have changed the outcome can never be known, but the possibility was powerful enough to drive reform. The bill passed that same year. The Vermont State Police was officially established on July 1, 1947, marking one of the most significant transformations in the state's modern history. Its mandate included coordinating major investigations, assisting local departments, and most importantly, managing large-scale search and rescue operations in Vermont's challenging terrain. The new agency brought standardized training, improved communication systems, and a centralized approach to emergencies. Over time, it developed specialized units, including search and rescue teams, canine squads, and wilderness response groups capable of navigating the very landscapes that had confounded earlier investigations. Paula's disappearance was not the only reason the agency was created, but it was unquestionably the catalyst, the case that exposed the need, rallied public support, and propelled the legislation forward. In the years that followed, the Vermont State Police would respond to thousands of calls across the state. They would handle rescues in remote areas, coordinate multi-jurisdictional investigations, and provide a structure that had been painfully absent in December of 1946. And though they never solved Paula Welden's disappearance, the agency carried her name quietly in its origins, a reminder of the young woman whose loss reshaped Vermont's approach to public safety. But the creation of a statewide police force did not quiet the unease that had settled over the region. The Long Trail remained a place of beauty and silence, and now of troubling associations. Hikers still passed through, but with a heightened awareness of the wilderness around them. Local residents continued to speak of Paula in hushed tones, particularly when winter approached and daylight grew short. Her disappearance had become the second in a growing pattern. Just a year earlier, Middie Rivers had vanished under circumstances equally baffling. Now Paula, young and widely searched for, had seemingly dissolved into the landscape. 2 disappearances in less than 2 years, both near the slopes of Glastenbury Mountain. It was not enough to declare a pattern, but it was enough to instill fear. And that fear would deepen as the decade progressed. For now, the state police was born, built from the failures of one tragedy. But the mountain itself remained unchanged, quiet, remote, and indifferent. Its forests still dense, its trails still winding toward the unknown. And soon, another disappearance would push the mystery further into terrain human logic could not easily map.
A man who vanished, not in the woods, but from a moving bus. By 1949, the disappearances near Glastenbury Mountain had already unsettled Vermont. The loss of Middie Rivers had shaken the confidence of local woodsmen, and the disappearance of Paula Welden had captured national attention, exposing the limits of early search efforts and reshaping state law enforcement forever. 2 vanishings in 3 years, both without a trace, had left the region wary. But still, people tried to believe they were isolated tragedies. That belief would soon be challenged by a disappearance unlike any other, one that seemed to defy not only logic but physical possibility. A man whose final moments were witnessed by a bus full of passengers who then vanished without anyone seeing him leave. His name was James E. Tedford. Tedford was a World War II veteran in his late 60s, living at the Bennington Soldiers' Home, a residential facility for veterans in Bennington, Vermont. His life after the war had been quiet, structured, and solitary. In late November and early December of 1949,
he traveled to St. Albans to visit family. These short trips were part of his routine. He was known for being punctual, predictable, and grounded in habit, the kind of man for whom unexpected changes were rare. On December 1st, 1949, exactly 3 years to the day as Paula Welden vanished, Tedford boarded a Greyhound bus to return to Bennington. The trip included several stops: Burlington, Rutland, and smaller station points along the route. The bus carried a typical mix of passengers, families, workers, travelers, each with their own destination, each with their own reasons for riding through rural Vermont on a cold, early winter afternoon. Witnesses later confirmed that Tedford was on board at the departure. They recalled him seated near the back, resting quietly, sometimes dozing. He carried personal belongings, a suitcase, a timetable, and small items typical of a veteran living modestly. As the bus continued southward, passengers noticed Tedford still in his seat. Some saw him awake, others later remembered him asleep. At no point did anyone observe him stepping off during a stop or rising from his seat in a way that suggested departure. He was simply there each time someone glanced his direction. But when the bus arrived in Bennington, Tedford was gone. His belongings remained above his seat in the overhead storage rack, neatly placed, untouched, exactly as they had been earlier in the journey. But the man himself had vanished. Greyhound drivers were trained to keep careful count of passengers, especially those traveling longer distances. On this trip, the driver reported no incidents, no sudden movements, no unusual activity. Other passengers confirmed that Tedford was on board at the previous stop, but none saw him rise, walk down the aisle, or step off the bus. It was as if he had disappeared while the bus was in motion. The conditions that day made this all the more perplexing. It was cold, with early winter setting in, but there were no storms, no hazardous roads that would have forced unplanned stops. The route was straightforward, stretches of highway bordered by fields, forests, and the foothills that led into the Bennington region. If Tedford had left the bus between towns, whether intentionally or accidentally, someone should have seen him stand, move, or open a door. But every witness was clear. No one did. Investigators faced an immediate challenge. They needed to reconstruct the bus's exact route, identify every stop, interview every passenger, and locate any point where a person might realistically leave the bus. Law enforcement questioned the driver, reviewed timetables, and drove sections of the route themselves. Not a single witness reported any disturbance, any unexpected door opening, or any sign of Tedford falling or jumping from the vehicle. Buses of that era had heavy doors controlled by the driver, not easily opened from the inside without notice. Windows were too small to climb out of, and even if Tedford had attempted such a thing, it seemed impossible that no one would have seen or heard it. Authorities expanded their search to the roadsides along the route. State police, local officers, and volunteers scanned ditches, fields, and wooded edges. They looked for footprints, clothing, discarded belongings, anything that might indicate where Tedford had gone. They found nothing. Searching on foot yielded no evidence. Searching from vehicles revealed no clues. No reports came in from residents living along the route. No hospitals admitted an unidentified injured man matching Tedford's description. No one reported seeing him walking the roads that day. Like the others who had vanished around Glastenbury Mountain, he had simply ceased to be present in the world. The bizarre nature of the disappearance drew regional attention almost immediately. Newspapers struggled to contextualize what had happened. It wasn't a hiker lost on an isolated trail or a child wandering into the woods. This was a man surrounded by witnesses, seated in plain view, who nonetheless managed to vanish between one stop and the next without attracting a single pair of startled eyes. Some speculated that he had disembarked unnoticed, but this contradicted every passenger's statement. Others suggested he may have exited during a brief stop when attention was elsewhere, yet no evidence supported this, and the driver insisted all passengers were accounted for. The more investigators examined the circumstances, the more improbable the event appeared. Tedford's personal belongings complicated the mystery even further. His suitcase remained securely packed. His ID was inside. There was no sign he intended to leave them behind. No note, no indication of distress, no sudden departure from routine suggested by his visit to family. To those who knew him, the idea that he would voluntarily abandon his possessions was uncharacteristic and deeply unlikely. With nowhere else to turn, investigators considered whether Tedford could have fallen from the bus due to a sudden jolt or accident, but again there was no evidence. The route passed through rural stretches, but the shoulders and embankments were checked thoroughly. Had he fallen, especially from a moving vehicle, some trace would almost certainly have remained. Nothing was ever found. In interviews, passengers expressed bewilderment. They had seen the man, remembered him, watched him quietly occupying his seat. He was there until he wasn't, and none of them could articulate how that transition had occurred in a closed vehicle with limited points of exit. By the time the investigation concluded, authorities acknowledged they had no explanation that fit the known facts. Tedford had boarded the bus. He was observed during the journey. His belongings remained behind. He did not arrive in Bennington, and the route revealed no sign of his path. 3 disappearances near Glastenbury Mountain in 1945, 1946, and now 1949 shared one chilling characteristic: a total lack of physical evidence. But in Tedford's case, the mystery was amplified by the fact that he had not been in the woods. He had not hiked a trail or ventured into remote terrain. He had been in the company of others, inside a confined space, engaged in an act as ordinary as traveling home after visiting family. Yet he was gone. His disappearance deepened the unease that had already begun to permeate the region. People living in Bennington and the surrounding towns were left to grapple with the horrifying implications that vanishings were not limited to wilderness, not confined to isolated trails or unpredictable weather. Something about the region seemed to swallow people even under circumstances that should have guaranteed safety. For the veterans at the Bennington Soldiers' Home, the loss was personal and unsettling. Tedford had survived the turmoil of war, only to meet an unknown fate during a peaceful bus ride in his home state. His empty seat became a symbol of the unexplained, a reminder that even the most ordinary moments could hold extraordinary uncertainty. His case remains one of Vermont's most inexplicable disappearances. Unlike the others, it did not occur deep in the forest or during an outdoor journey. Yet it would soon be grouped with the vanishings of Rivers and Welden, forming a pattern that would shape what people came to call the Bennington Triangle, an area marked by disappearances so sudden, so complete, and so resistant to explanation that they remain among the most haunting mysteries in American true crime history. And the disappearances were not over. Another life, younger, more fragile, would soon be claimed.
By 1950, southwestern Vermont had already endured 3 disappearances in 5 years, each unsettling, each unexplained, and each tied in some way to the slopes and shadowed wilderness around Glastenbury Mountain. The names of Middie Rivers, Paula Welden, and James Tedford had become part of the region's uneasy vocabulary, spoken cautiously, often in whispers, and always with the understanding that something in the land did not behave as expected. But nothing prepared the community for what happened in October of that year, when the mountain's silence reached beyond adults, beyond hikers and veterans, and touched the life of a child, a boy whose presence should have been unmistakable,
and whose disappearance would deepen the sense of dread that had already taken root. His name was Paul Jepson. 8 years old, bright, energetic, and known throughout his small community, Paul often accompanied his parents during their daily routines. His father worked as a caretaker and his mother as an attendant at the local town dump, a place where families, especially in rural areas, sometimes brought their children as they completed their work. It was not glamorous, but it was familiar and predictable, a place where Paul had played safely many times before. On October 12, 1950, Paul arrived with his mother, wearing a bright red jacket, a detail that would later become one of the most haunting elements of the case. Red is a color that stands out sharply against the muted autumn tones of Vermont's October woods. It catches the eye quickly, even at a distance. It is easy to spot, or should have been. That morning, Paul played near his mother's truck while she tended to her tasks. She kept him within sight, as she always did, checking on him regularly. The area around the dump was open and clear, bordered by rough terrain and forest edges, but not swallowed by them. There were pathways and access roads, places where someone could walk, but it was not the kind of deep wilderness where one could vanish instantly. Paul was only out of his mother's sight for a short window of time, minutes, not hours, when she turned her attention back to the truck, expecting to find him exactly where she had seen him last. The space was empty. At first, she assumed he had wandered a short distance away, perhaps chasing an animal or exploring a familiar corner, but when her calls went unanswered, the initial flicker of concern became immediate fear. Authorities were notified quickly. Unlike earlier disappearances, this one involved a child, and the urgency was absolute. Search efforts mobilized with remarkable speed. Police officers, firefighters, townspeople, and members of the newly formed Vermont State Police all converged on the area. For the first time, the state's new law enforcement infrastructure would be tested in a major wilderness emergency, a moment shaped in part by the lessons learned from Paula Welden's case. Bloodhounds were brought in almost immediately. Searchers described Paul's scent as strong and clear, allowing the dogs to begin tracking with precision. Their path led away from the dump, along a road that bordered the forest. The dogs traveled confidently, pulling their handlers forward with the momentum that comes from a clear trail. But then, abruptly, the scent stopped. The exact point where the trail ended became a focal point of investigation, a stretch of road not far from the dump, positioned between residential properties and the wooded foothills of Glastenbury Mountain. The sudden cessation of the scent baffled the handlers. It did not fade gradually, as would be expected if Paul had wandered deeper into the woods. Instead, it ended sharply, as if he had left the ground entirely or been moved in a way the dogs could not follow. This moment, the sudden stopping point, remains one of the most chilling details of the Jepson case. Search teams expanded outward, sweeping through fields, brush, and forest edges. The terrain beyond the road grew more rugged, rising toward the steeper slopes associated with the earlier disappearances. Given that Paul was only 8 years old, investigators initially doubted he could travel far uphill into such challenging territory on foot, but in the absence of leads, they widened their efforts into those areas as well. Planes were dispatched overhead, flying low passes across tree lines and clearings. Volunteers formed human chains in the woods, spaced closely enough to minimize the chances of stepping past something critical. Local farms, barns, culverts, and sheds were inspected. Ponds and streams were checked. The community, still carrying the memory of Paula Welden and Middie Rivers, threw itself into the search with desperate determination. The red jacket, that vivid piece of clothing, should have made Paul easy to spot. But as the days went by, the forest remained silent. No flash of red appeared between the trees, no tracks emerged along the roadside, no torn fabric, no scattered belongings, no voice answering the calls that echoed through the valley. The emotional toll on Paul's parents was profound. They had been only yards away when he disappeared.
Their routine, one they had repeated countless times before, had transformed in the matter of minutes into a tragedy. Their proximity to the event made it all the more incomprehensible. To lose a child while hiking deep into remote wilderness is one thing. To lose them in a familiar open space is another entirely. The community rallied around them, offering support as the search stretched into days and then weeks. But hope faded with each passing hour. As autumn deepened and the nights grew colder, the likelihood of survival diminished sharply. Eventually, the official search was scaled back, though locals continued to keep their eyes open for any sign of Paul during their daily routines. He was never found. Of all the disappearances that took place between 1945 and 1950, Paul Jepson's may be the most heartbreaking in its simplicity. A boy at play, a brief moment of distraction, a silence that followed, and a trail that ended abruptly on a roadside near the same mountain that had already swallowed 3 individuals without leaving evidence behind. For residents of Bennington and the surrounding towns, the disappearances were no longer abstract tragedies affecting hikers or adults with outdoor experience. They had touched a child, someone who should have been the easiest to see, the quickest to find, and the hardest for a community to lose. Paul's case amplified a fear that had been growing quietly since 1945. It reinforced the belief that something about the region defied explanation. Whether the cause was environmental, human, or simply an unforgiving convergence of circumstances, the effect was undeniable. People near Glastenbury Mountain vanished without a trace. And as the year came to a close, the mystery deepened once more. One final disappearance, occurring just weeks after Paul's, would bring a new dimension to the pattern. A woman familiar with the terrain would vanish, only to be found months later under conditions that raised even more questions. Her case would be the only one to yield a body. And even then, the answers would never come.
2 weeks after the disappearance of 8-year-old Paul Jepson, another life was claimed near the slopes of Glastenbury Mountain. This final case in the cluster of disappearances that later became known as the Bennington Triangle would differ from the others in one crucial way. After months of searching, a body would eventually be found. But instead of offering clarity, its discovery only deepened the mystery, reinforcing the sense that something about this region defied ordinary understanding. Her name was Frida Langer. On October 28, 1950, Frida, 40 years old, physically strong, familiar with the outdoors and accustomed to hiking the terrain around Somerset Reservoir, set out with her cousin Herbert Elsner for a short walk near their family campsite. Frida had spent much of her life exploring this region. She understood its steep hills, its sudden elevation shifts, and the way light faded early in the October woods. This was not a remote expedition or a strenuous trek. It was a casual hike through land she knew well. The morning began normally. The air was cool, crisp with late autumn sharpness. Fallen leaves covered the ground in deep, rustling layers. The nearby reservoir mirrored the gray sky overhead. Frida and Herbert walked along familiar paths, moving easily across ground they had covered in previous seasons. But shortly into the hike, Frida slipped while crossing a small stream. Her clothes became wet. Annoyed but unhurt, she decided to return to camp to change before continuing the walk. Herbert continued along the path, planning to meet her there shortly. Frida turned back, less than a mile from camp, following a straightforward, uncomplicated route. She never arrived. It was the kind of short walk that should have taken minutes, a direct line between 2 familiar points, a path she had traveled repeatedly. Yet somewhere in that narrow span between the brook and the camp, she vanished completely. When she did not return within a reasonable amount of time, Herbert retraced the route. He called her name, expecting to find her changing clothes or waiting near their tents, but the camp was silent. The path was empty. There was no sign of Frida. Searching began immediately, first by family members, then by other campers and residents of the area. As hours passed without any sign of her, authorities were notified.
By nightfall, a familiar scene began to unfold, one that had become frighteningly common in this region. A massive search effort was launched. Unlike some of the earlier disappearances, Frida's case provided investigators with a narrow timeline. She had fallen into the brook at a specific location, turned back at a known time, and was expected to arrive at camp minutes later. Teams knew exactly where she had been, exactly where she was headed, and the short stretch of terrain she would have crossed. In theory, this made the search more manageable. The reality defied that logic entirely. Over the next several days, hundreds of volunteers joined professional search teams, including the Vermont State Police, which had been formed only 3 years earlier. The U.S. Army was brought in to assist, and aircraft were deployed over the region, scanning the landscape, searching for areas where a person might be visible from above. The terrain between the brook and the campsite was scoured multiple times. Teams searched on foot, on horseback, and with dogs. Every rock shelf, every hollow, every thicket was checked. The shoreline around Somerset Reservoir was inspected carefully. The frigid water itself was searched by divers. The dense forest that surrounded the area, dense but not impassable, was combed in overlapping grids. Nothing was found. Frida had vanished without leaving so much as a footprint. Days passed, then weeks, then months. By winter, snow covered the search area, burying any evidence that might have existed beneath layers of ice. The official search was eventually suspended, though small groups of volunteers continued to check the region whenever weather allowed. For her family, the waiting became a burden carried through the long Vermont winter, a hope that fought against the likelihood that the forest had taken her beyond reach. 6.5 months later, in early May of 1951, a startling discovery was made. A group of hikers encountered human remains near Somerset Reservoir, in an area that had already been searched extensively during the early days of the investigation. The body was in a state of advanced decomposition, consistent with having been exposed to natural elements for months. The remains were identified as those of Frida Langer. The location of her body immediately raised troubling questions. How could search teams, including dozens of trained professionals, the military and aerial units, have missed her in a location that had been inspected repeatedly? The region around the reservoir was a high-priority search zone. It was checked early and checked relentlessly. Authorities noted that the level of decomposition prevented them from determining an exact cause of death. The body offered no clear signs of foul play, no definitive evidence of an accident, no obvious clues of exposure or injury. The forensic tools available at the time limited what investigators could conclude. All they could say with certainty was that Frida died some time after her disappearance, and that the location of her body did not match what the search history suggested should have been possible. If the body had been there all along, searchers should have found it. If it had not been there earlier, then how and when did it arrive? These questions have never been answered. The discovery, rather than providing closure, intensified the mystery. For the first time in the series of disappearances, investigators had a victim to examine, yet they walked away with no greater understanding of what happened than they had with the 4 earlier cases. Frida's family, while grateful to have her remains recovered, faced the impossible weight of a tragedy that carried no explanation. They had no understanding of her final moments, no narrative to hold on to, no cause of death to bring resolution. They only had the knowledge that she had walked through a place she knew well, turned back toward camp, and vanished within a span of minutes, only to reappear months later under circumstances that defied the exhaustive search efforts launched on her behalf. With Frida's disappearance, the pattern of the previous years solidified. The community had lost an experienced woodsman, a college student, a war veteran, a young boy, and now a seasoned hiker, all within a 5-year span, all within a small geographic radius, and all without clear evidence explaining their fates. Her case, perhaps more than any other, underscored the limitations of human understanding when faced with vast, unpredictable wilderness. The forest had returned her body, but not her story. The disappearances of 1945 through 1950 had now formed a pattern too striking to ignore. Sudden vanishings, no clear evidence, massive search failures, a shared geographic focus near Glastenbury Mountain, and, in Frida's case, a body found in a place that should have yielded answers, but instead brought only more confusion. As word spread about these strange events, researchers, journalists, and locals began to look for the thread connecting them. The region took on a reputation that echoed in newspapers, in investigations, and in the whispers that passed between residents of nearby towns. In the years that followed, a name emerged to describe this cluster of mysteries: the Bennington Triangle, and Frida's case would stand as the final disappearance within that infamous 5-year span, the only one with remains recovered, yet still devoid of answers. Her story closed the decade's haunting chapter, but it did not close the investigation, it did not quiet the fear, and it did not stop people from searching for meaning in a pattern that seemed to defy every attempt to understand it. What happened to Frida Langer remains unknown, and with her loss, the mountain's silence deepened.
By 1950, 5 people had vanished in or around the wilderness of Glastenbury Mountain, each disappearance separate in circumstance, yet eerily similar in effect. In the space of only 5 years, the region surrounding this remote peak had been transformed from a quiet, sparsely populated stretch of forest into the center of one of the most perplexing sequences of missing person cases in American history. Individually, each disappearance might have been dismissed as misfortune: a hiker lost, a hunter injured, a tragic accident in rugged terrain. But together, the cases formed a pattern that investigators, researchers, and local residents could not ignore. As the names of Middie Rivers, Paula Welden, James Tedford, Paul Jepson, and Frida Langer accumulated, the question became unavoidable: what was happening on and around Glastenbury Mountain? To understand the haunting connections between these cases, one must look closely at the geography itself, the land that has shaped every story, every search effort, and every theory that has tried to explain why so many people disappeared here with so little trace. A wilderness of sharp boundaries and shifting conditions. Glastenbury Mountain sits within the Green Mountain National Forest, a dense, sprawling wilderness characterized by steep elevations, narrow valleys, and thick, unbroken timberland. Though not the tallest mountain in Vermont, it possesses features that amplify its isolation. The terrain transitions abruptly from accessible hiking paths to difficult ravines and shadowed hollows. One wrong turn can lead into steep, unstable ground where footing becomes treacherous. Fallen leaves conceal holes and drops. Moss-covered stones shift under pressure. Streams cut sharply through the earth, carving trenches that become hidden traps under foliage. Weather on Glastenbury is equally unpredictable. Sudden fog is common, a thick blanket that can settle across the mountain in minutes, obscuring visibility and disorienting even experienced woodsmen. Temperatures drop quickly, especially at narrow elevations where sun rarely penetrates the canopy. In autumn, twilight falls early. In winter, storms arrive suddenly and with severity. The land does not welcome error, and it does not forgive it easily. These natural features form the first layer of the pattern connecting the disappearances: sudden disorientation in unpredictable wilderness. Disappearance without evidence. The most striking similarity across the 5 cases is the complete lack of physical evidence. Middie Rivers, 1945. An experienced guide disappears only steps ahead of a hunting party. Search teams find no footprints, clothing, or equipment. Paula Welden, 1946. A college student wearing a highly visible red parka vanishes along a well-traveled portion of the long trail. Not a single item is recovered. James Tedford, 1949. A veteran disappears during a routine bus ride. His bags remain on board. He does not. Paul Jepson, 1950. A child in a bright red jacket goes missing near a dump.
bloodhounds trace his path to a roadside, and it ends abruptly. Frida Langer, 1950, a hiker who falls into a brook, turns back toward camp, and never arrives. Her body is later found in an area that had already been searched extensively. 5 missing individuals, 4 never found, 1 found where she should not have been missed, and not a single definitive clue. This absence of evidence became the second defining element of the pattern, and the one that most deeply unsettled investigators. Cases in wilderness settings often yield limited information, but to have 5 disappearances in the same region, each leaving behind no clear trace, was statistically extraordinary. The question that haunted every search effort was not simply where these individuals had gone, but how they had vanished so completely. Proximity in space and time. When plotted on a map, the cases cluster around the slopes and surrounding woodlands of Glastenbury Mountain. Though not every disappearance occurred directly on the mountain itself, the region forms a tight geographic radius. Rivers disappeared near Hell Hollow on the mountain's western slopes. Welden vanished along the long trail which skirts the mountain. Tedford disappeared on a bus route that passed the mountain's foothills. Jepson vanished only miles from the same area. Langer disappeared near Somerset Reservoir, just northeast of the peak. The radius is small enough that no investigator could dismiss the geographic connection. Rural wilderness can swallow evidence, but why here and why so consistently? The timeline intensified the concern. Between 1945 and 1950, disappearances occurred in 1945, 1946, 1949, 1950, 2 cases. 5 disappearances in 5 years in a region with minimal population, low tourist traffic, and a relatively stable outdoor culture. Patterns like this rarely emerge without cause, even if the cause remains unknown. The weight of coincidence and the birth of a name. Patterns do not always indicate a single cause. Geography, timing, and human vulnerability can intersect in ways that appear connected, even when they are not. Investigators acknowledged this possibility at the time. But for the public, for the people who lived with this fear, the disappearances formed a pattern that felt deliberate, even if the land itself was the culprit. The sheer concentration of cases, the absence of clues, and the proximity to Glastenbury Mountain created a narrative that spread first through local rumor, then through regional reporting, and eventually through national attention. In later decades, researchers and writers would give this region a name: the Bennington Triangle. It was not a scientific label, nor an investigative conclusion. It was a way to describe a cluster of events so unlikely, so geographically focused, and so haunting in their lack of resolution that no other term seemed adequate. The name captured not only the disappearances themselves, but the psychological impact they had on Vermont. The fear, the confusion, the lingering sense that something within those woods remained beyond human understanding. The disappearances did not make Glastenbury Mountain infamous. The patterns did. And as the public struggled to make sense of these patterns, investigators faced another challenge, just as daunting, just as emotionally draining, and just as unsolved. Why had every search failed? The next chapter would attempt to answer that question.
Each disappearance in the Glastenbury region triggered a wave of urgency that swept through southwestern Vermont. Families mobilized, neighbors stepped forward, entire towns paused their daily rhythms to comb through forests, ravines, and ridgelines in the hope that someone lost in the wilderness might still be found. These were not passive communities. They were rural towns accustomed to hardship, to assisting one another, and to navigating the challenges of mountain life. Yet time and time again, despite hundreds of volunteers, trained officers, aerial support, and the best resources available, every search failed, except for the one that ended in the grim discovery of Frida Langer months later, under circumstances that raised more questions than answers. To understand why these searches failed, it is necessary to look at how they unfolded, what they confronted, and how the land itself worked against even the most determined searchers. The Search for Middie Rivers, 1945. The Hunt for the Hunter. The first disappearance set the tone for all that followed. When Middie Rivers vanished in November 1945, the search response was fast and massive. Nearly 1,000 people participated over the course of several days, a staggering number for a rural region in the mid-20th century. Local woodsmen who knew the terrain intimately searched alongside volunteer firefighters, police officers, and members of the National Guard. But the terrain that Rivers had navigated with confidence became a labyrinth for those who tried to follow. Searchers moved through steep ravines where loose stones slid underfoot. They crossed icy brooks and dense stands of hemlock that blocked the sky. They shouted his name into vast spaces where sound seemed to be absorbed by the forest instead of carried through it. Every theory about what might have happened, a fall, an injury, a misstep, was investigated. Yet not one piece of evidence suggested where he had gone. Rivers had disappeared less than a quarter mile ahead of people who knew him, and that single fact, that he vanished in plain proximity, shook the community more deeply than any explanation could have. The Search for Paula Welden, 1946, the largest operation Vermont had ever seen. The effort to find Paula Welden dwarfed all previous searches in Vermont history. Her disappearance ignited the attention of the nation. Newspaper reporters poured into Bennington. Radio broadcasters relayed updates daily. The college community, heartbroken and desperate, organized teams of students to scour the woods. Volunteers arrived from across New England, responding to the call for manpower. Bloodhounds were deployed. Airplanes flew over the long trail, tracing its twists and watching for flashes of red beneath the canopy. For the first time, Vermont faced the challenge of managing a large-scale search in a wilderness that few outside the region truly understood. The terrain resisted them at every turn. Fresh snowfall obscured tracks. Dense underbrush masked fallen branches and depressions that might have hidden evidence. The long trail branched unpredictably into side paths that volunteers, unfamiliar with the mountain, could easily mistake for main routes. Searchers repeatedly retraced ground, sometimes unknowingly, while other sectors went unchecked due to gaps in coordination. Despite the enormous scope of the search, Paula Welden left no trace, not a single piece of clothing, no footprints, no sign that she had ever left the main trail. The pressure surrounding her disappearance highlighted the need for stronger, unified emergency response systems. It was this failure that directly led to the creation of the Vermont State Police in 1947. But even with improved coordination, the land around Glastenbury Mountain continued to resist investigation. The Search for James Tedford, 1949, when the land offered no place to look. Unlike the others, Tedford did not disappear in the woods. He vanished from a moving bus, a detail that eliminated the possibility of searching for him in a defined, predictable area. The problem for investigators was not insufficient manpower, it was insufficient direction. Where do you search for someone who disappears on a route stretching dozens of miles? How do you retrace a journey with no witnesses who saw the man leave? Police drove the route repeatedly, scanning shoulders, fields, and wooded edges. Volunteers searched for hours near bends and embankments where a fall might have occurred. But a bus is not a wilderness. It is a confined space, monitored by passengers who were certain that the man was present at one stop and gone by the next. The failure here was not one of effort, it was one of possibility. The disappearance left no starting point for a search, no direction to follow, and no place to apply the manpower that had proven so ineffective in the previous cases. Tedford's case stands as a unique fracture in the pattern, an indication that the problem extended beyond trails and terrain into something harder to categorize and even harder to investigate. The Search for Paul Jepson, 1950, a trail that ended suddenly. When 8-year-old Paul Jepson vanished on October 12, 1950, search teams acted with urgency shaped by past failures. Bloodhounds were deployed quickly and tracked his scent to a road.
the sudden stop of that trail became one of the most confounding details in the entire sequence of cases. If Paul had continued into the woods, the dogs likely would have followed. If he had walked down the road, the scent should have persisted. If he had collapsed or hidden nearby, ground searches should have found a clue. But the trail ended abruptly, not faded, not weakened, ended. Volunteers scoured the area, moving outward in expanding circles. Searchers checked ravines, barns, sheds, and the edges of nearby fields. Aircraft swept overhead. Roads were monitored closely, and local residents were interviewed extensively. But the search grid, though more organized than earlier ones, encountered the same challenges that haunted every effort near Glastenbury: unpredictable terrain, thick vegetation, and a landscape that allowed evidence to vanish quickly and decisively. Despite the boy's bright red jacket, a color that should have been visible from hundreds of feet away, nothing emerged. The search for Frida Langer, 1950, where the land itself contradicted the evidence. When Frida Langer vanished after turning back to camp, search efforts began within hours. Because officials knew her exact route, they had a rare advantage, a narrow corridor to focus on. Yet despite this advantage, no trace of her discovered during the initial searches or during the massive multi-agency efforts that followed. The fact that her body was eventually found in an area that had been searched thoroughly, repeatedly, became one of the most troubling elements of the entire pattern. Searchers who had walked that ground months earlier were adamant she was not there at the time. The area was visible. It had been covered by foot teams, horses, dogs, and aircraft. It was not a concealed ravine or hidden drop-off. It was open enough that a person lying on the ground should have been seen. How her remains ended up in that precise location remains unknown. Why did these searches fail? Several factors contributed to the failure of the search efforts, each grounded in the realities of wilderness operations. 1. Terrain that obscures everything. The forests around Glastenbury Mountain are incredibly dense. Fallen leaves, moss, brush, and undergrowth hide tracks quickly. Ravines and hollows can conceal bodies entirely. 2. Weather that changes rapidly. Fog erases visibility. Rain washes away scent trails. Snow buries evidence. Cold temperatures reduce the range of sound and dull the senses of searchers. 3. Limited technology in the 1940s and 1950s. No GPS, no infrared imaging, no drones. Communication relied on radios with limited range, and maps were often imprecise. 4. Human error in the chaos of search operations. Large volunteer-driven searches can become chaotic. Overlapping grids, missed areas, and duplicated efforts are common challenges, even under ideal conditions. 5. A region already defined by isolation. Glastenbury Mountain was largely uninhabited, full of abandoned roads, and devoid of landmarks. Orientation was difficult, and evidence could disappear without ever being noticed. A pattern of silence. What frightened investigators most was not the rugged terrain or the harsh weather. It was the consistency with which the land refused to offer any answers. Across 5 disappearances, hundreds of searchers, multiple aircraft, bloodhounds, horses, National Guard involvement, local, state, and interstate law enforcement, all of it yielded nothing. The silence was total. The mountain remained indifferent. And as these failures accumulated, so did the fear that the disappearances were not isolated incidents, but connected by something far more elusive, a pattern shaped not by intent or malice, but by the cold indifference of nature and the unforgiving complexity of wilderness. It was this pattern of silence, this repeated inability to uncover even a shred of evidence, that transformed a series of tragedies into one of the most unsettling mysteries in American true crime history. With the searches exhausted and the questions piling up, investigators and the public turned to theories, not to solve the disappearances, but to try to make sense of them. That is where the story turns next.
When 5 people vanish in a remote region over the course of 5 years, each under different circumstances, each leaving behind almost no trace, Investigators, researchers, and the public inevitably seek answers, not because theories solve the mystery, but because the human mind cannot tolerate a void. It reaches out for explanation, for narrative, for something that can make sense of events that feel senseless. But in the case of the Bennington disappearances, every theory put forward carries limitations. Every explanation leaves gaps. No single idea can neatly account for the disappearance of a woodsman, a college student, a veteran, a young boy, and a hiker, all near the same mountain, all swallowed by silence. The theories exist because the evidence does not. Here, we examine the major explanations presented over the decades, factually, critically, and without endorsement, acknowledging the reality that each can illuminate some aspects, yet none can explain the whole. 1. Environmental hazards and geographic danger. The simplest and most widely accepted explanation is also the most grounded in fact. The terrain around Glastenbury Mountain is dangerous. This is not superstition, it is geography. The mountain is riddled with hidden hazards, steep ravines, sudden drop-offs, deep crevices, unstable soil, and thick undergrowth that can obscure the ground beneath. One misstep can send a person sliding out of sight, especially in late autumn when fallen leaves create a slick carpet over uneven terrain. If an individual fell into one of these natural traps, their remains could be concealed so thoroughly that even large-scale searches might miss them. The thick vegetation and geological structure of the region can make visibility extremely limited, even within a few feet. This theory may explain Middie Rivers, who walked ahead of his hunting party and might have stepped into a concealed ravine. Paula Welden, who could have wandered off a trail or become disoriented, leading her into treacherous ground. Frida Langer, whose slip into water earlier that day, could suggest diminished mobility or hypothermia that made her vulnerable. But it cannot easily explain James Tedford, who disappeared from a bus, or Paul Jepson, whose scent trail ended abruptly at a roadway. Environmental hazards offer possible explanations, but only for some of the disappearances. 2. Sudden weather changes and disorientation. Glastenbury Mountain is known for volatile weather. Fog forms quickly, temperatures drop sharply, visibility can go from clear to almost non-existent within minutes. For hikers or hunters, this can be disorienting. Individuals can lose their bearings, walk in circles, or mistakenly follow old logging paths that lead deeper into the wilderness. This theory is strengthened by historical accounts. Early loggers and residents recorded stories of people becoming lost in the region even during times of settlement. They noted how the landscape seemed to shift, not literally but perceptually, confusing those who believed they knew the terrain well. Weather-induced disorientation could explain Rivers, who may have moved in a direction he did not intend. Paula Welden, whose early winter hike left her vulnerable to temperature and visibility changes. Frida Langer, who might have taken a wrong turn on her way back to camp. But again, this theory does not address Tedford or Jepson. 3. Human involvement, foul play, or abduction. Though there is no conclusive evidence of foul play in any of the Bennington cases, investigators did not ignore the possibility. Potential for abduction near roads. For Paul Jepson, whose scent ended abruptly at a roadway, abduction was considered. A vehicle stopping at the right moment could, in theory, explain why the bloodhounds lost the trail. Yet no witnesses reported seeing a suspicious car, no tire marks suggested a hurried stop, and rural roads of that era had minimal traffic, meaning an abductor would have had to appear within a narrow window. Potential human interaction on trails. In Paula Welden's case, investigators considered whether she may have encountered someone on the trail. She was last seen heading deeper into the woods alone, but there was no evidence of a struggle. No personal belongings were found. The Tedford case. The possibility of foul play was raised for James Tedford as well, but disappearing from a bus without being seen required conditions that strained plausibility. No witness reported a disturbance. No physical evidence supported an attack. Human involvement remains possible in several cases, yet in all 5, a lack of evidence limits this theory to speculation.
4. Intentional disappearance or voluntary departure. In missing person investigations, the possibility of deliberate disappearance is always examined. For Paula Welden, some suggested she may have chosen to leave her life behind, but no evidence supports this. She left all her belongings behind. She made future plans for the evening. She left no note, no money, no additional clothing. She was seen entering the long trail, not boarding transportation. For James Tedford, voluntary departure was briefly considered, but his luggage remained untouched, and his age, habits, and lack of mobility made intentional flight unlikely. For Rivers, Jepson, and Langer, voluntary disappearance was never seriously considered. A child, an experienced guide, and a woman returning to camp after a slip, none had circumstances that suggested intent to vanish. Of all the theories, this one is least applicable across the 5 cases. 5. Animal predation. Large predators in Vermont during the 1940s and 1950s were limited. Black bears were present but generally avoid humans unless provoked. Mountain lions were considered regionally extinct. Wolves were not present. Even if an animal attack occurred, investigators would expect to find blood, clothing remains, tracks, drag marks. None were found. Animal predation is unlikely to account for any of the disappearances, except potentially specific scenarios where remains could have been scattered, but even then, some trace should have surfaced. 6. The role of old logging roads and abandoned infrastructure. During the height of Glastenbury's logging industry, countless makeshift trails, cart paths, and wagon roads were cut into the mountain. When the industry collapsed, these paths were abandoned and quickly overwhelmed by regrowth. Many remained visible only as faint depressions or misaligned clearings. To an experienced woodsman, these paths might seem familiar. To a hiker, they might appear to be a trail. To a lost person, they could be fatal, leading miles off course into areas impossible to find with precise knowledge. This explanation fits Rivers, who may have misjudged a familiar area; Paula Welden, who might have followed a false trail; Langer, whose route back to camp could have overlapped with an old logging track. But it does not explain Tedford's disappearance or Jepson's abrupt scent cutoff. 7. Serial offender theory. Over the years, some writers proposed the idea of a serial offender operating in the region. This theory gains occasional attention because serial offenders often exploit wilderness areas. However, there is no evidence linking the 5 disappearances through behavioral patterns. The victims varied dramatically in age, gender, and circumstances. Tedford's bus disappearance does not fit the profile of a typical abduction. No suspect or forensic indication has ever emerged. Law enforcement never endorsed this theory, and historians consider it weak in explanatory power. 8. A convergence of multiple factors. This is not a single theory, but an acknowledgement of complexity. The region around Glastenbury Mountain is geographically dangerous, environmentally unpredictable, lightly populated, threaded with confusing, fading infrastructure, difficult to search effectively. It is entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that the disappearances were caused by different factors: environmental hazards for some, disorientation for others, human involvement in one or two, unforeseen accidents in another. But the mysterious force that binds the cases is not a single cause. It is the silence of the land, the absence of evidence, the failure of every search, the unanswered questions that remain after more than 70 years. Theories cannot fill the void. What makes the Bennington disappearances so unsettling is not any single theory, nor any single case, but the collective inability of all available explanations to form a complete picture. 5 people vanished. 4 were never found. 1 appeared where she should not have been missed, and no theory, not environmental, not human, not psychological, explains all 5. The void remains. It is an emptiness that investigators, families, and researchers have tried to fill for decades, but which the land itself refuses to illuminate. And that void is precisely what led to the emergence of a phrase that would define the region for generations: the Bennington Triangle. As the theories multiplied and the silence deepened, popular culture began to take hold of the story, amplifying it, dissecting it, and turning a cluster of unsolved tragedies into one of America's most enduring true crime mysteries. That is where the narrative turns next.
By the time the 1950s came to a close, the disappearances near Glastenbury Mountain had already etched themselves into the consciousness of Vermont. But as the decades passed, the stories did not fade. Instead, they grew, branching outward through journalism, regional folklore, and eventually national media. What had begun as a series of isolated tragedies evolved into one of the most discussed wilderness mysteries in the country. The term Bennington Triangle did not exist in the years when the disappearances occurred. It would not enter public vocabulary until decades later. But long before the phrase was coined, the stories themselves were already taking root, spreading through news archives, local memory, and the quiet conversations of those who lived in the region. Even in the earliest retellings, one theme was unmistakable: a sense that something about Glastenbury Mountain resisted clarity. Newspapers and the first public memory. In the mid-20th century, newspapers were the primary source of public information, and the Bennington disappearances received significant press coverage, both locally and nationally. The Middie Rivers case. Local papers reported on the scale of the search, emphasizing how unusual it was for an expert woodsman to vanish so completely in familiar territory. The Paula Welden case. Her disappearance generated sustained national attention. Articles in major newspapers highlighted the failure of coordinated search efforts, the emotional pleas of her father, and the lack of physical evidence. These reports later played a role in the founding of the Vermont State Police, giving the story lasting historical weight. The Tedford, Jebsen, and Langer cases. Regional papers documented each disappearance, gradually tying the events together through shared geography and eerily similar circumstances. Even before the concept of the triangle existed, journalists recognized the pattern. Through these articles, public awareness took shape. Readers across the Northeast and eventually across the country became familiar with the strange sequence of vanishings centered around a largely uninhabited mountain in rural Vermont. Newspapers provided the first lifeline for these stories, preserving them long enough for researchers and writers to rediscover them decades later. Books, writers, and the forming of a name. In the 1980s, author and folklorist Joseph A. Citro began documenting unusual events and historical mysteries from around New England. His work preserved regional lore and lesser-known incidents, weaving them into cohesive narratives that helped define the cultural identity of rural Vermont and its surrounding states. It was Citro who coined the phrase Bennington Triangle. Drawing on decades of archived news and oral tradition, he identified the 5 disappearances between 1945 and 1950 as a cluster of events that demanded attention. The term was a nod to the commonly known Bermuda Triangle, but Citro's intention was not to impose supernatural meaning. Instead, he used the phrase to describe a geographic region with a documented history of unexplained vanishings, a wilderness area marked with unusual difficulty and disorientation, a cultural memory preserved through stories, not just official records. By framing the disappearances collectively, Citro brought them into popular culture in a new and powerful way. His work introduced the story to readers who had never heard of Glastenbury Mountain or Bennington's strange history. The phrase Bennington Triangle caught the public imagination not because it promised answers, but because it captured the haunting uncertainty that defined the region. Documentaries and television coverage. As true crime and unexplained mysteries became staples of television programming in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Bennington Triangle entered the medium of visual storytelling.
While the details varied by production, documentaries consistently highlighted the isolated location, the 5 disappearances, the massive but fruitless search efforts, the founding of the Vermont State Police, and the baffling lack of evidence. The stories lent themselves naturally to cinematic treatment. Dense forests, shifting weather, and remote trails provided a chilling backdrop for narrators describing ordinary people who vanished into thin air. As documentaries reached new audiences through cable TV and later streaming platforms, the Bennington Triangle gained status as one of the most recognized wilderness mysteries in American true crime history. The role of oral tradition and local memory. In southwestern Vermont, the disappearances are not just media stories, they are local history. Residents who grew up in Bennington, Shaftesbury, Woodford, and Somerset heard fragments of the stories long before documentaries revisited them. Some learned about the vanishings at school, others heard older relatives recall the searches, memories of watching National Guard trucks rumble through town or seeing search parties hike into the woods with lanterns and ropes. For many families, the disappearances carried emotional weight because of personal connections. A grandfather who helped search for Middie Rivers, a parent who remembered the fear after Paula Welden vanished, a neighbor who lived near the Jebsen dump site, a relative who knew the Langer family. These memories kept the stories alive long after news headlines faded. In small communities, events that shake public safety are rarely forgotten. They settle into collective memory as quiet warnings, reminders of a time when familiar woods became places of uncertainty. Even today, many older residents speak of Glastenbury Mountain with caution. The disappearances remain part of the ambient awareness of the region, passed down as a blend of fact, cautionary tale, and enduring mystery. Folklore versus fact. Over time, the convergence of media coverage, oral tradition, and cultural interest created a landscape where folklore and fact occasionally blurred. Some retellings incorporated speculative themes, not as evidence, but as narrative devices that reflected public fascination with the unknown. However, historians and researchers emphasize the importance of distinguishing between folklore and verifiable fact. The facts are straightforward. 5 disappearances occurred between 1945 and 1950. 4 remain unsolved. 1 was found under unexplained conditions. All occurred within or near the same geographic region. None yielded definitive evidence of cause.
The folklore grew around the void left by these facts, around the silence of the mountain, the unexplained patterns, and the public's attempt to understand the unanswerable. In true crime circles, the Bennington Triangle is often referenced alongside other clusters of historical mystery, but unlike purely mythic locations, it is built on events that were documented extensively through official reports, newspapers, and public records. The fascination persists not because the stories are sensationalized, but because they remain unresolved. The Bennington Triangle today. With each new generation, interest in the disappearances resurfaces. Podcasts, documentaries, articles, and books revisit the events, analyzing them from new angles and reassembling the fragments of evidence with modern investigative perspectives. The region itself has changed very little. Glastenbury Mountain remains largely uninhabited, a quiet expanse of wilderness reclaimed by nature after its industrial decline. Trails still run along its western slopes, but the deep interior remains lightly traveled. Despite its remote beauty, the mountain carries an aura shaped by decades of collective memory. Many hikers speak of an uneasy quiet in its upper stretches, a silence that feels heavier than that found in other parts of the Green Mountains. Whether this is psychological or environmental, the effect is real. Historical markers, local museums, and college archives preserve the stories, ensuring that the victims are not forgotten and that the events remain part of Vermont's documented history. The Bennington Triangle continues to be taught, discussed, and debated, a case study in the limits of human investigation and the power of an unresolved mystery. Even without supernatural embellishment, the facts alone are compelling enough to keep the story alive. A mystery that captures imagination. The Bennington Triangle endures in popular culture because it marries three elements that have long fascinated the public. 1. A remote wilderness landscape, beautiful, challenging, unpredictable. 2. A series of unexplained disappearances, ordinary people gone without evidence. And 3. A pattern that suggests connection without revealing one. Together, these elements create a narrative that is haunting precisely because it refuses to provide resolution. The stories are not closed loops. They point inward, toward the mountain, toward silence. And it is that silence that has given the region its cultural weight. The disappearances inspired reforms, reshaped policing, influenced media, and carved themselves into the mythology of New England. They remain a testament to the power of the unknown, the way unanswered questions can travel further, last longer, and cut deeper than the ones we solve. The next chapter turns to the human side of this mystery, the families left behind, the grief that endured, and the emotional legacy carried by those whose loved ones stepped into the wilderness and never returned.
Behind every disappearance in the Bennington Triangle lies a family whose life was permanently altered, a family who woke on an ordinary morning believing the day ahead would be like any other, only to find that their world had quietly shifted into something they could neither interpret nor escape. For them, the disappearances are not folklore or regional mystery. They are lived experiences, marked by a grief that lingers long after the public attention fades. The 5 vanishings between 1945 and 1950 did not simply leave investigators baffled. They left families suspended between hope and despair, caught in the painful limbo created when a loved one is neither found nor forgotten. These are the silences that endure long after the search's end. The Rivers family, a woodsman who was never supposed to be lost. When Middie Rivers disappeared in November of 1945, his family faced a form of disbelief that bordered on impossibility. Rivers had been a guide, a hunter, a lifelong resident of the region. His identity, his reputation, even his sense of self were rooted in his skill within the wilderness. He was the person others trusted to keep them safe on the mountain. To lose someone so capable in the very environment he understood better than anyone else felt like a violation of the natural order. His family could not reconcile the idea that he had simply vanished. In the days following the disappearance, relatives joined search teams, calling his name into the cold November air, hoping he had been injured and unable to respond. When the search grew larger, they waited at home for news, the kind of news that often seemed only seconds away but never arrived. As days turned into weeks, the uncertainty became its own torment. There was no moment of closure, no discovery to mark the transition from hope to mourning. Instead, grief settled in gradually, a dull ache fed by unanswered questions. For his family, the mountain had taken someone who knew it best, and that loss created a fear that words struggled to contain. The silence of the forest had consumed a man who had spent his life reading its signs. The question they carried, how could this happen to him, was one that would never fade. The Welden family, a father's endless vigil. Paula Welden's disappearance in 1946 resonated far beyond Vermont, but for her family, the national attention was a double-edged sword. Her father, William Welden, endured the spotlight while grappling with the private anguish of losing a daughter whose life had barely begun. In the first days of the search, Welden stood at the center of the operation, coordinating efforts, speaking with reporters, and pressing officials to dig deeper, search wider, act faster. His presence brought urgency to the investigation, but it also revealed cracks in the system, cracks he confronted with growing frustration. He believed more could have been done in the crucial early hours. He challenged investigators, he questioned witnesses, he pushed for resources that did not yet exist in Vermont's decentralized law enforcement landscape. His grief transformed into determination, a determination that would lead, indirectly but undeniably, to the founding of the Vermont State Police. But while structural change grew from her loss, the personal wound remained unhealed. Paula's disappearance left the Welden family without answers, without closure, and without even a piece of evidence to hold on to. Her belongings sat untouched in her dorm room. Her red parka, which should have been unmistakable against the gray winter woods, was never found. Her father followed every lead, no matter how faint, long after the official search had ended. For years he carried the hope that she might still be alive. For years after that, he carried the regret of not knowing. Grief without resolution becomes a companion, unwelcome but ever present. For Paula's family, that grief lasted the rest of their lives. The Tedford family, a disappearance without geography. The disappearance of James Tedford in 1949 brought a different kind of anguish to his surviving family members, not simply because he vanished, but because he vanished in a context that defied comprehension. People disappear in wilderness. People do not simply disappear from buses. Tedford had been seen by passengers throughout the trip. His belongings were left behind. No witness saw him leave. No one reported a disturbance, and no trace of him was ever found along the route. For his family, the questions were not rooted in terrain or weather or trail conditions. They were rooted in contradiction. How could a man surrounded by others become absent without notice? How could a journey that should have been so ordinary become a point of total rupture? There was no location to search, no ground to comb, no forest to blame. The loss was abstract, harder to grasp, harder to explain, harder to accept. Their relatives lived with a mystery unlike any other in the Bennington pattern. They could not imagine foul play without evidence. They could not imagine an accident without a body. They could not imagine voluntary disappearance without motive. What remained was a vacancy, a hollow where certainty should have been. A man who had survived war and hardship had disappeared on a peaceful rural bus ride. For his family, the lasting question was simple but devastating. Where could he possibly have gone? The Jepson family, a child lost in moments. The disappearance of 8-year-old Paul Jepson in 1950 inflicted a type of pain distinct from all the others, the pain of losing a child in circumstances that defied reason. Paul's mother had looked away for minutes, not hours. He had been wearing a bright red jacket that should have been visible from a great distance. The area was familiar. The window for disappearance was heartbreakingly small. When the bloodhounds followed his trail, the Jepson family hoped desperately for resolution. But when his scent ended abruptly at a nearby road, their fear deepened into something worse, a sense of the inexplicable. For Paul's parents, every detail of the day replayed endlessly in memory. What had they missed? What could they have done differently? How could a child so close to home vanish so completely? Grief for a lost child never ends, but grief without answers becomes something even more tormenting, a loop with no exit. The Jepsons lived with the knowledge that their son had slipped beyond their reach in a moment so brief it barely existed. They lived with the uncertainty whether he had wandered into the woods, been taken by a stranger, or met some fate the investigation never uncovered.
For them, the mystery was personal, immediate, and unbearable, and unlike the other families, they had to carry the additional understanding. The disappearance of Frida Langer later that same year brought a paradoxical kind of grief to her family, the only case in the series where a body was eventually recovered, one that offered no answers. Her family endured weeks of uncertainty, months of silence, and then the shock of discovery when hikers found her remains in an area that had been searched repeatedly by trained teams. This detail haunted investigators, but it tormented the Langer family even more. They were forced to confront impossible questions. Had she been there all along, somehow overlooked by searchers? Had her body appeared there later, and if so, how? What happened in those minutes after she turned back to camp? The official cause of death could not be determined due to decomposition. There were no clear signs of foul play, no definitive injuries, no final narrative to bring clarity. Her family received the answer of where she was, but not the answer of what happened or why. Instead, they received the kind of closure that is only partial, only surface level, leaving behind an emotional landscape as fractured as the investigation itself. Grief that outlived the century. Across all 5 cases, the families shared a wound defined not just by loss, but by lack of resolution. The uncertainty created sleepless nights, unending hope, recurring nightmares, private grief behind public attention, a lifetime of questions with no place to settle. Some families clung to hope until their final days. Others accepted loss, but could not accept mystery. Some retold the stories again and again, searching for something missed. Others avoided the details entirely, unable to bear the weight of imagining their loved ones' final moments. But all shared the same reality. Not knowing is a form of suffering all its own. These disappearances did not simply become part of Vermont's historical record. They became part of the emotional architecture of the families who lived through them and the communities that surrounded them. Their pain, their confusion, and their enduring sorrow became woven into the social memory of the region. And even as decades passed, the mountain itself remained silent.
The final chapter turns to that silence, to the legacy of a region shaped not by answers, but by absence, and to the mountain whose shadow still falls across the stories of those who vanished. There are places in the American landscape where history feels unfinished, where the land itself seems to hold a quiet, heavy memory of what has unfolded upon it. Glastenbury Mountain is one of those places. Even today, when hikers lace their boots and step onto the forest floor, they pass into a wilderness shaped not only by steep terrain and dense timber, but by the unresolved stories of those who never returned. The mountain does not look dangerous. Its slopes rise gradually from the valley, covered in spruce, fir, and maple. Streams cut narrow paths through moss and stone. The forest canopy filters sunlight into a gentle green haze. But beneath this beauty lies a harsh truth. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 lives disappeared into this landscape, and the land gave almost nothing back. For decades, the weight of these losses has lingered in Vermont, not in superstition, but in the enduring ache of unanswered questions. A region forever marked. Glastenbury Mountain today is quiet. The logging towns that once dotted its slopes vanished more than a century ago, leaving behind cellar holes swallowed by roots and stone walls obscured by undergrowth. Trails intersect like faint scars. Old railroad beds dissolve into the forest. Few people live here now, and even fewer venture deep into its interior. But the mountain is not empty. It is filled with memory. The stories of Middie Rivers, Paula Welden, James Tedford, Paul Jepson, and Frida Langer have become part of the landscape itself, the emotional topography of a region that carries the imprint of grief and bewilderment far beyond the years when the disappearances occurred. Their names are spoken with a quiet respect, a solemn acknowledgement of tragedies that resist explanation. For many Vermonters, the mountain is not merely a geographic feature, it is a place defined by absence, a reminder of how quickly a familiar world can change and how deeply a mystery can burrow into the collective imagination. Fear that never fully faded. The disappearances created a ripple effect that extended long after the last search party packed its gear and left the woods. Residents of Bennington, Woodford, Shaftesbury, and Somerset developed a caution that lingered for generations. Parents told children not to wander near the mountain's base. Hunters avoided certain areas out of instinct rather than superstition. Students at Bennington College grew familiar with the story of the sophomore who left campus for a walk and never returned. Even today, the mountain holds an aura that experienced hikers describe as different, not dangerous in any supernatural sense, but marked by a stillness that feels unusually deep. When wind moves through the upper forest, it whistles through the remnants of old rail lines and the decaying foundations of a long-gone town. The atmosphere echoes with a history that has not yet resolved itself. Fear here is not loud or dramatic. It is subtle, steady, and rooted in the reality that 5 disappearances remain unsolved despite immense effort, national attention, and decades of inquiry. A wilderness that defied investigation. Search teams did not fail for lack of effort. They failed because the wilderness resisted them. This mountain is vast, rugged, and unpredictable, a place where a person can be steps away from a search party and remain invisible under the forest's dense cover. Even today, with modern technology, search and rescue teams acknowledge the challenge of locating lost hikers in the region. In the 1940s and 1950s, without GPS, without drones, without thermal imaging, the chances of finding someone were dramatically lower. The silence that swallowed the 5 victims was not created by myth. It was created by the limits of human ability and the sheer indifference of nature. The land did not respond to pleas or shouts or coordinated grid searches. It did what wilderness does: conceal, transform, and erase. A legacy of change. Not all legacies of the Bennington disappearances are defined by loss. Some created progress, influencing the structure of public safety in Vermont for generations. The disappearance of Paula Welden, an 18-year-old college student whose case drew national scrutiny, directly catalyzed the creation of the Vermont State Police in 1947. Before then, Vermont was one of the only states in the country without a centralized law enforcement agency. Paula's case exposed the gaps in coordination between towns and highlighted the urgent need for organized statewide response. Her loss became the turning point for a state learning to protect its citizens more effectively. This change does not ease the grief of her family or resolve the mystery of her final moments, but it stands as a testament to how tragedy can reshape systems, ensuring that future emergencies receive the response her case deserved. Enduring research and the refusal to forget. Over the years, historians, journalists, and true crime researchers have revisited the disappearances with determined curiosity. Some examined archival police records, others studied topographical maps or interviewed aging locals who remembered the searches. Though theories emerged, environmental hazards, disorientation, human involvement, none solved the mystery. What these examinations accomplished instead was something more subtle, yet deeply important. They kept the names alive. They ensured that Middie, Paula, James, Paul, and Frida were not lost to time, that their stories were not reduced to footnotes in forgotten newspaper archives. They preserved the cases as part of Vermont's living history, an open page in a book that has yet to close. For families, the research offered comfort in its own way. It meant the world had not moved on completely. It meant someone still cared enough to ask questions, to examine evidence, to honor the lives behind the mystery. In the realm of true crime, that persistence is a form of remembrance. A mountain that remains unchanged. The land on Glastenbury Mountain bears no markers of what happened. There are no memorials along the long trail for Paula, no plaques near the slopes where Rivers disappeared, no roadside sign where Paul Jepson's scent was last tracked. The mountain remains exactly as it was, massive, silent, and unmoved. Nature does not respond to the tragedies that unfold upon it. It does not reveal secrets simply because time has passed. Weather patterns remain unpredictable. Vegetation continues to thicken. Old logging roads fade deeper into obscurity. The same challenges that existed in 1945 exist today. This indifference is what makes the Bennington Triangle so haunting. It is the understanding that the land remembers but does not explain. Visitors who hike the trails today walk through the same silence that surrounded Middie Rivers in 1945, that enveloped Paula Welden in 1946, and that held firm through each disappearance that followed. The wilderness gives nothing back. It simply endures. Why the stories matter. At the core of the Bennington Triangle is not fear or legend or speculation. At the core are people. 5 individuals whose lives intersected with a landscape at moments that cannot be reconstructed. Their stories remind us that even the most capable outdoorsman is vulnerable, that a brief walk can become a point of rupture in a life, that a community can search with all its strength and still come away with nothing, that answers do not always emerge from experience, skill, or effort. These disappearances confront the uncomfortable truth that human understanding has limits, that nature, for all our tools and technology, remains larger than us in ways that can still surprise and humble us. And they remind us of something deeper still. Mysteries endure not because they are unsolvable, but because they touch something inside us that resists closure. The echo that remains. Today, Glastenbury Mountain stands as a symbol of both beauty and loss. Trails wind through towering spruce trees, streams cut clear paths through stone, wildlife moves quietly under the canopy. To the eye, it is serene, but beneath that serenity lies the echo of 5 names, 5 stories, and 5 families who never received the answers they sought. The mountain holds those stories not through malice or intention, but through silence, a silence that has never been broken. In the end, the legacy of the Bennington Triangle is not about mystery alone. It is about memory. It is about people who vanished, people who searched, and people who refused to forget. It is a reminder that some chapters in history do not close neatly. Some remain open, unresolved, and quietly waiting in the places where they first unfolded. And so the names endure. Middie Rivers, Paula Welden, James Tedford, Paul Jepson, and Frida Langer. 5 lives carried into history by the mountain that never returned them. Their stories remain not because of myth, but because of truth. That somewhere in the wilderness of Glastenbury Mountain, between its ridgelines and ravines, the silence still holds what the world has never been able to uncover.
Share these stories. Keep their names alive. Because somewhere in the forests of Glastonbury, the silence still holds their truth.